Well, hi there, everybody, and welcome to Hi There with Rabbi Leah. I'm glad you're joining me again today. This is a special edition. I was supposed to do some live programming in a couple of our buildings today, but because of the situation with COVID and not being able to really get any good sized groups together, I decided to record this instead so that everybody on campus would have an opportunity to watch it. So this is part two of my discussion about the mikvah. Now, I got a phone call from a resident who I haven't called back yet, who wanted to know about something I said yesterday, which was the use of the mikvah as part of tahara, which is the ritual washing of a body prior to burial. And I mentioned that that the mikvah, in addition to its other uses, is also used to immerse a um, a body, a deceased person, for purposes of ritual purification. I want to make it clear that these are not the same mikvahs that are in the community that are used by the general public. These are special mikvaot that are used at the funeral homes which do the tahara. So, without getting off on a tangent about tahara and the ritual washing of a body, there is initial washing of the person, and then there is a way in which they are immersed in a special mikvah that is at the mortuary or the funeral home. So, we're not doing ritual immersion of bodies in community mikvahs where people go, where you and I would go. Okay, I hope that clarifies that. So, want to talk a little bit about this picture, which is a horrible picture, and I tried to decipher it, and I tried to find something larger and more a clearer explanation, but it wasn't easy. And so you have to understand that the construction of a mikvah is very, very detailed. And that's why you don't have one on every street corner, because it requires a very high level of rabbinic oversight and in the way in which it's constructed, the way in which the water runs, and so on and so forth. So, as I mentioned yesterday, the traditional rules regarding construction of a mikvah are based on those that are specified in classical rabbinic literature. So, and according to those rules, the mikveh has to be connected to a natural spring or a well of naturally occurring water. So, rivers and lakes, it's okay to use an ocean. You can use a cistern filled by rainwater to act as the mikvah's supply, as long as you then don't take that rainwater, put it in a separate vessel, and put it into the mikvah. It's got to be the water I mentioned yesterday, that you can't take the water from the rain barrel, put it in another vessel, and then put it into the mikvah. It's got to come directly from the source. And a river that dries up on occasion cannot be used because it's assumed that the springs that feed that river are no longer functioning. So, it's entirely possible that a dry riverbed can fill up again from rainwater, but there's no source of spring water, natural water coming into it. All right. So, according to the regulations, we talked about how much water has to be in a mikvah, and that that there are a certain amount of seah of water, which equates to a certain number of gallons. But it's a very convoluted system, and that is why, um, as I said, we don't have a mikvah on every corner, at least not here in the United States. Possibly in ultra Orthodox neighborhoods, because going to the mikvah is a very private experience. and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so there are pipes and hoses and fittings, and all of them have to be freestanding. So nobody can stand there and hold the pipe through which the water is running. And there are lots of requirements that have to be fulfilled. So there's also requirements for the manner in which the water can be stored and transported. And as I said, the water has to flow naturally. Um, there are some rulings about whether tap water can be used if it's the only source, and so on. But most contemporary mikvahs are indoor constructions that involve rainwater that is collected from a cistern and then passed through a duct by gravity. It has to go by gravity into an ordinary kind of a bathing pool. The mikvah can be heated, taking into account, certain rules. So sometimes a mikvah is not unlike a spa. And I've actually been to a couple of very newly built mikvaot that are just gorgeous. It's kind of like going into a mini spa for a different purpose. So, um, all right. Traditionally, the mikveh was used by both men and women to regain ritual purity after various events, according to regulations that have been laid down by the Torah and in classical rabbinical literature. So, the Torah requires that after a male has an emission, whether that is through sexual activity or any other way, they are required to bathe in the mikvah. Okay, because in order to do certain types of sacrifices and to participate in certain types of offerings, a male had to be pure. And uh, they became impure through this act of emission. Ezra, the scribe Ezra, wrote that wrote a list of the certain types of afflictions or situations in which somebody became impure. So, for example, tzav, also known as tzava, which are abnormal discharges of bodily fluids. Tzara'at, which is a skin condition. Metzora, which is an inflammation or a scaling of the skin, or leprosy, something like that. Traditionally, we would say leprosy. And anyone who comes in contact with someone suffering from leprosy is considered impure and has to go to the mikvah. Anyone who comes in contact with a menstruating woman has to go to the mikvah. And a Kohen who is about to be consecrated for some special duty must go to the mikvah. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, after sending the goat away, Azazel, the goat on which all of the sins of the community are placed, is considered impure and goes to the mikvah. The Kohen who performs the ceremony of the red heifer. Now, the red heifer ritual was a ritual by which a cow that was red without any blemishes was became a korban, a burnt offering. The ashes were mixed with a libation of water and were in some cases sprinkled, and in some cases, like in the case of a woman suspected of adultery, were drunk, were imbibed. And so that Kohen who performed that ritual was now also considered to be ritually impure. Also, after a contact with a corpse or a grave, a Kohen, that those who are Kohanim are not permitted or supposed to go to a funeral. They're not supposed to be around a corpse. I remember in particular, and I think it was in Sfat, which is in northern Israel, a very mystical town where Isaac Luria introduced Jewish mysticism and where Kabbalah sprang. That uh, you have to, there was actually a separate little building there, a little stone building on this ancient cemetery in which the Kohen could sit during a funeral so that they were not in direct proximity of the body. And you know that traditionally, when a person is buried, they have tahara, which is the cleaning of the body, and then they are put in a shroud and they go right into the ground. Um, we don't do that here in the United States. There are a lot of rules and regulations about casket liners or grave liners and all kinds of things. But for the most part, in certain parts of the world, the body goes directly into the grave, and so uh, a Kohen could be in much closer contact to the deceased than we might be with somebody actually in the casket. So, a lot of the classical rabbinical writers conflated some of these ideas and they conflated the rules for emissions for men with menstruating women. It also became customary for the Kohen to fully immerse themselves before Jewish holidays. And so many of the laity, the laypersons of these communities, adopted the same practice. And of course, converts to Judaism are required to undergo full immersion in water. Definitely in the Orthodox community, definitely in the conservative community. And now, as I mentioned yesterday, more recently, probably the last 20 to 25 years, maybe a little longer, in the more progressive movements, rabbis are requiring a Beit Din for immersion, which is a tribunal of three Jews. Who those Jews are there's a different answer to that question depending upon if you're asking a Reform rabbi or an Orthodox rabbi. But generally, there is a Beit Din, and that Beit Din will ask questions of the ger or the gioret, the person who's about to convert. And most of those questions are um, geared towards that individual's journey to becoming a Jew, um, certain oaths and pledges about uh, uh, tying one's destiny to the Jewish people, and so on. Okay, as I mentioned, some Jewish funeral homes do have a mikvah for immersing a body during that purification process. They don't use a public one, they use one in the funeral home. So let's talk about modern practice. And by modern, I mean what happens nowadays, even though it might be Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, New Age, whatever it might be. Orthodox Judaism generally adheres to these classical regulations that we see and the traditions. And so Orthodox Jewish women are obligated to immerse in a mikvah um, following their menstrual cycle and prior to resuming sexual relations with their husbands. So, women who are not married are not required to go to the mikvah because it is presumed that if they are not married, they are not having sexual relations. So it is married women. That includes brides prior to getting married. And yesterday I mentioned that some of you may have had one and only one experience in going to the mikvah, and that was probably right before you got married, and maybe then never again after that. I remember talking to my mother of blessed memory about what that experience was like for her. And she never went back again. She said it was humiliating and degrading and awful. And of course, she was, 22 years old and had a very Orthodox grandparents who came from Russia, met in the United States, but her grandfather was a kosher butcher in Brooklyn, and they kept strictly kosher, and so her mother was already deceased by the time she got married, but her grandmother probably took her to the mikveh, and my mother says it was not a very pleasant experience. So, as I said, married women go also after childbirth. And in accordance with Orthodox rules concerning modesty, men and women are required to immerse in separate mikveh facilities in separate locations, or to use the mikveh at times designated for men and designated for women. And I will talk a little bit more about that next week on Chai There, because there's some really fascinating things that are going on nowadays in terms of scheduling these appointments. So in most mikvaot in Orthodox communities, you will have women coming in to use the mikvah. And then they come in through the front door, and then there is a separate door by which they exit the mikveh that is a private door that no one goes into. No one comes into the building. They go out through that door. And why? Because the presumption is that that woman is now um, uh, pure, in a pure state, and therefore she is able to go home and have sexual relations with her husband, and that's a very private thing, and nobody should really know anybody else's business. So most mikvaot, as I said, have a door by which a woman can leave the facility without being seen, so that the neighbors don't all chatter about, we know where she's going and we know what she's going to be doing when she leaves here. Okay, so sniut, the idea of modesty, is very important in Orthodox communities, which is why, of course, men and women dress in a very modest way. Women, covering their shoulders and their cleavage, wearing sleeves that are longer that cover the elbows, because elbows are seen as a seductive part of the body. Similarly, longer skirts that cover the knees, and so on and so forth. Um, so converts to Orthodox Judaism, regardless of gender, are also required to immerse in a mikveh. It's also customary for Orthodox Jews to immerse before Yom Kippur, and married women will sometimes do so as well, even if it's not part of their monthly nidah. So in customs of certain Jewish communities, men also use the mikvah before Jewish holidays. And the men in certain other communities, especially Hasidic and Haredi communities, also practice immersion before every Shabbat. And that was not something I was aware of until the year I lived in Israel, when I was studying to become a rabbi. And I went to visit ultra-Orthodox Hasidic cousins who lived on a moshav in Medi'in. And sadly, this was the moshav which was completely destroyed by fire a couple of years ago. And now there are some glimmers that parts of it are being rebuilt. And this is a cousin through marriage that is in charge of this process. So I remember going to spend a Shabbat with them, and I took the bus from Jerusalem and stayed with them over Shabbat. And my cousin, male cousin, went to the mikveh on Erev Shabbat before candle lighting. So men are probably given the number of holidays and the fact that there are 52 Shabbatot every year, using the mikvah more frequently than women, at least in traditional circles. And that was something that I frankly was not aware of. I mean, I knew that the priests, the ancient priests immersed. I knew that the Kohen Gadol immersed, but I did not know that men in the Orthodox tradition, particularly those in the Hasidic and Haredi communities, will practice immersion every Shabbat. Some even immerse in the mikveh every day. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Maybe they're using it as a bathtub. I don't know. But the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is treated by many Orthodox Jewish authorities as being forbidden territory. And yet there are a number of groups that do permit access, but they require immersion prior to going to the Temple Mount as a precaution, because this is such a holy place. This is the mount on which Moses was said to have sacrificed Isaac, or almost sacrificed Isaac, and it is the site of holy. It is a site of holiness for all three of the Abrahamic faiths. And so certainly in Judaism, where there are some groups that are given limited access, they will immerse prior to going. Orthodox Judaism also requires that vessels, as I mentioned, vessels and utensils that are used for cooking go to a mikvah before they're used for food. And I have seen that happening in mikvaot in Israel, where people will bring their utensils, metal utensils, and so on and so forth, pots, pans, to a mikvah. Now, once they have gone in the mikvah, if they should become unclean again, you accidentally stir your chicken soup with a spoon that was used to make yogurt the day before, it's no longer kasher. That has to be re-koshered. Something a little bit different that I've seen happen is on Pesach. Needless to say, not everybody is wealthy enough to afford 4 sets of dishes. You need milk and meat for the full year, and then you need a milk and meat for Pesach that has not had any chametz on it, right? So around Passover time in Israel, sometimes in the Orthodox communities, particularly in the Mea Shearim, I have actually seen these enormous black kettles that almost like cauldrons with boiling water, in which people are coming to toivel, to do tevilah, with their pots and pans and silverware and so on, in order to kosher it for Pesach, because they don't have a way of doing it at home. And this way the implements are boiled and therefore are now kosher for Passover. And by the way, this is what we do with some of our dishes at Seacrest for Passover, which is that we do have kosher for Passover dishes, but we don't have 2 sets. And I forget whether it is the milchik or the fleishik that we have a separate set that's kosher for Passover. With the rest of the dishes, as well as with the cooking implements, because we don't have 2 sets of pots and pans and ladles and strainers and spoons and everything else. We will run all of those items through our dishwasher on boiling hot water 3 times. So we do 3 runs with anything that's going to be used for Passover in order to kosher it for Passover. So it's not a mikvah, but it is considered okay to do. All right. So, uh, or obligatory immersion in Orthodox Judaism is just, part of Orthodox Jewish life. And similarly, in modern Orthodoxy, women will go, as I mentioned, following their menstrual cycle prior to resuming marital relations. Men will go prior to holidays, prior to Shabbat, maybe even daily, depending upon, you know, how observant they are. Immersion in the mikvah is also done by a bridegroom on the day of his wedding, according to the custom of some communities. So not only the bride goes, but the bridegroom would go as well. Of course, it's not like going and getting a couple's massage. They don't go at the same time, but by a father prior to the circumcision of his son, according to the custom of some communities. As I mentioned, by a Kohen prior to a service in which the Kohen is going to pronounce the priestly blessing. Again, according to some communities. So the priestly benediction, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, may God bless you and keep you, and so on. The Kohen will go. Immersion for men is much more common in Hasidic communities, and almost non-existent for men in other communities like the German Jewish communities. Okay. There have been some recent Orthodox writings that connect the laws of impurity to the narrative in the beginning of Genesis. And actually, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan said that according to Genesis, by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that Adam and Eve had brought, because of that, they brought death and suffering into the world. And so Rabbi Kaplan points out that most of the laws of impurity relate to some form of death. So how does that relate to a nidah, a woman who is having her menstrual cycle and then goes following to the mikvah? Well, there is a form of death. She has not conceived a child, and that is considered to be a status change. So she is going from a person who is not conceived to a person who is now potentially able to conceive once she has immersed. So the timing of all this is very interesting, because generally a woman is a nidah for 7 days. And then she has to wait another 7 days before she can go to the mikvah. So we are now into 14 days. And most women are, of course, most fertile around the 14th day of their cycle. And therefore, when they go home to resume marital relations with their husband, they are at their most fertile and most ripest and most able to conceive. So, they say somebody who comes in with a contact of one of the forms of death has to immerse in the water, which is described in Genesis as flowing out of the Garden of Eden, which was the source of life, in order to cleanse oneself of this contact with death, and by extension, contact with sin. So that first source of the water came right from the garden, and we talk about these flowing streams of water. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook offered an additional message for the mikvah. He said that by immersing ourselves in water, we're forced to recognize